A life devoted to building community on the margins, living in voluntary poverty, and offering hospitality to unhoused men, women, and children inevitably involves significant engagement with mental illness. Catholic worker houses of hospitality welcome individuals with psychological disabilities who may have become unhoused in part due to these illnesses, as well as those who developed mental illness as a result of trauma that they endured through exposure to violent social, political, and economic circumstances. Day was surrounded by mentally ill community members from the arrival of her first guests, who found their way to her apartment after reading the first edition of The Catholic Worker, until her death at Mary House in 1980. The initial audience that Day envisioned for her Thérèse book was likely comprised of regular readers of the Catholic Worker paper, both Catholics and non-Catholics alike, a sympathetic audience who would have been accustomed to thinking of mental illness as it related to the unhoused guests on the soup line, but not in the context of sanctity. Even for us, it's very easy to imagine a saint who serves and even lives with those who are mentally ill, but it is perhaps harder to imagine a saint who herself suffered from mental illness. And yet, this is exactly what Day offers us in Thérèse, a saint whose embrace of suffering included not only family tragedy and the ravages of infectious disease, but also the personal experience of depression, anxiety, and psychological anguish. Day's direct, blunt portrayal of mental illness in the Martin family reveals something incredibly significant for us. Psychological disability is not a barrier to holiness. One can be mentally ill and still be a saint. Unlike many religious accounts of the interior life, which treat depression and spiritual dryness as a single category, Day presents Thérèse as someone who did experience what might be referred to in Carmelite terms as a dark night of the soul, and who also suffered from chronic mental illness from childhood. Following Thérèse's recovery from a childhood fever that the Martin family feared would carry off their youngest daughter, Day writes, "If we can call hypersensitiveness or scruples an illness, then there was another crisis for her to pass through also." Day describes scruples as a religiously situated obsessive-compulsive disorder in which the sufferer cannot help chewing over and returning to their own sins or engaging in uncontrollable performances of religious devotion. Thérèse's first attack of scruples lasted nearly 2 years, and she had a headache almost every day. She was weepy and would constantly burst into tears and fret on and on again. In her own writing, quote, "Thérèse's account of the nervous, neurotic state she was in for almost 2 years does not take many pages, nor does the story of her illness at the departure of Pauline." Both of these illnesses, scruples as well as the former mysterious ailment, would be considered today to be some form of mental or nervous breakdown, and certainly such patients do not receive the sympathy they feel they need, nor the understanding, Day writes. Thérèse was eventually able to break free from this suffering when she was 14, and she regained her strength of mind. She calls this moment a conversion, and these last few months of childhood before she entered Carmel were beautiful and full of grace. Later in life, Thérèse had a lot of compassion for another nun in her convent who was suffering from something very similar. Thérèse mentions the words of Christ on caring for the sick and clearly indicates that mental illness is part of this work of mercy that Jesus commands of his followers. At the close of this chapter, Dorothy recommends praying to Thérèse for those who are mentally ill, stating, quote, "I am sure that we should pray to Saint Thérèse about those around us who are going through this suffering, these nervous breakdowns, these delusions. If her way is for all, surely we should recognize her experience and her desire to help in this field too." Thérèse was not the only member of her family to suffer from psychological illness. Her maternal grandmother, described as deeply religious and frugal, likely experienced the same kind of scrupulosity that would later afflict her granddaughter. Louis Martin, who had offered himself as a victim soul, taking on some of the suffering of Christ to himself, had a stroke at the end of his life that limited his verbal communication and led him to wander until his brother-in-law had him institutionalized for his own safety. But Day also writes into this text a poignant, sensitive portrait of Thérèse's middle sister, Léonie, the problem child, and is to her the odd duck of the Martin family that we will turn our attention to now. Although her sisters were very discreet in their own writing, as an adult, Leonie spoke of having endured a, quote, detestable childhood. She was sickly as a baby, struggled in school, had behavioral issues that the adults in her life found hard to manage. In all likelihood, we would today recognize Leonie as autistic. And there is, in fact, a lay association of autistic Catholics who take their name from her, the Leonie League for the Advancement of Autistic Persons. Autism itself is not a mental illness, but autistic children and adults who are forced to conform to the standards of a world designed for and by allistic or neurotypical people are often so wounded by the constant stresses that this involved that they develop psychological disorders. Very little was known about autism and neurodivergence in the late 19th century, and Louis and Zélie struggled to accommodate the sensory, relational, and educational needs of their middle daughter. Foreshadowing her later difficulties in entering religious life, Leonie was repeatedly sent home from the convent schools her mother enrolled her in, and suffered academically from these interruptions in her learning. Day writes, quote, "It is in this day often the difficult child that is sent away to a school, rather than the oldest and brightest and most useful members of the family." Leonie, by her own words, was so backward that she had to be tutored at the age of 23. She said that she had always suffered from a sense of inferiority. Zélie found a school situation for Leonie in town where she could live at home, but Zélie found out that the two teachers were probably abusing and neglecting, likely overworking, a little girl who boarded there. Zélie was protective, even though the girl in question was not her own daughter, and brought the issue to court. Ultimately, she was minimally successful in helping the girl, but Dorothy suggests that witnessing her mother's efforts might have contributed to Leonie's eventual deep sensitivity to the poor. Leonie continued to struggle with emotional outbursts and behavioral issues, and eventually Zélie discovered the cause. When Leonie was 14, Zélie finally learned that the maid in their home, Louise, had been emotionally abusing Leonie for years and terrorizing her into compliance. Marie, her sister, was the person who eventually won Leonie's confidence enough that this all came out, and Zélie forbid Louise from ever speaking to Leonie again. Following this discovery, Zélie dedicated herself to providing Leonie with the tenderness and emotional security she needed, and Leonie blossomed under the attention. Finally free from abuse, Leonie became more social with her family, and some of her chronic health issues cleared up. The theme of linked rejection and redemption, which Day returns to over and over in this text, is perhaps more apparent in Leonie's life than of the any other members of the Martin family. Writing retrospectively, Leonie admitted to being very lonely as a girl and meditated on Christ's humiliation and apparent failure at his crucifixion. Like her sisters, Leonie felt a call to religious life and tried to enter the Poor Clares and then Carmel, and was rejected or sent home multiple times. Leonie only successfully entered the Visitation Convent at the age of 35, 15 months after Thérèse's death. While she was still alive, Thérèse would write to Leonie and encourage her in all the good work she was doing out in the world. Although in all likelihood, the loneliness of Leonie's childhood continued into her years as an unmarried laywoman, the last of the sisters still left at home. In her adolescence, Day writes that Leonie was developing too in a most heroic way in her relationships with the poor people that it had always been the habit of the family to visit and help. The family's biographer recollects an instance of Leonie visiting and bathing a dying neighbor, and then preparing the woman's body for burial. Leonie was completely devoted to her mother and was devastated at the news of Zélie's terminal diagnosis, stating that she wanted to die in her place. I'd like to note that a cause for Leonie's canonization was formally opened in 2015, and since the diocesan phase of the inquiry was closed in February of 2020, Leonie will likely be named venerable within the next few years. In the two anecdotes aforementioned, we can see evidence of the deep moral conviction, sensitivity, and literal-mindedness that are typical of autistic people. When Leonie told Zélie that she wanted to give her own life in her mother's place, she meant it. My point in bringing this forward is to note that if Leonie is declared a saint, it will not be in spite of her autism, but through it. We become saints by fully living into who God means for us to be. In Leonie's adolescence, her mother was able to nurture her neurodivergence, recognizing that God had created Leonie with purpose and intention, even if Celie did not have the words to explain what made this daughter different. Day's loving depictions of the Martin family, particularly the most vulnerable members, are perhaps best contextualized in her lifelong devotion to the communion of saints. For Day, the saints are alive, they are contemporary, and they are present with us in the most unexpected faces and moments. Although never explicitly mentioned in Thérèse, no discussion of the convergence of sanctity and mental illness can overlook that figure of the holy fool, that wandering madwoman torn from the pages of one of Day's beloved Dostoevsky novels. The late Jim Forrest, former Catholic worker turned Orthodox lay theologian, writes that to accuse someone of being mentally ill or crazy is one of the sharpest insults that our culture can muster. Quote, "Yet there are saints whose acts of witness to the gospel fly in the face of what most of us regard as sanity. The Russian church has a special word for these saints, yurodivi, meaning holy fools, or as it is sometimes put, fools for Christ's sake. These are wild souls whose odd behavior many people would regard as madness." In the traditions of the Eastern Church, these men and women who would likely be jailed or institutionalized in our world are acknowledged and recognized as spiritual teachers who see the face of God with astounding clarity. Day was a great admirer of Russian culture. She loved their composers, their literature, and their spirituality. She eventually became an oblate at a Benedictine monastery whose particular charism included prayer for the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches. Day also had a particular gift for recognizing the hidden saints everywhere around us, the people we interact with at school or in the workplace, as well as those who we perhaps choose to ignore when we see them huddled into doorways in the winter times, or perhaps panhandling on street corners. Forrest writes, "It is the special vocation of holy fools to live out in a rough, literal, breathtaking way the hard sayings of Jesus. Like the Son of Man, they often have no place to lay their heads, and again, like him, they live with empty pockets." Day's social embrace of the spirituality of Saint Thérèse encompasses what we might call a preferential option for the mentally ill. Her goal in describing the psychological disorders that Thérèse and Léonie suffered from is not only to move us to compassion for others who suffer from similar elements, although Day certainly wants that. Day's larger aim is to expand our understanding of holiness, to allow us to see how God's grace illuminates the most fragile, the most forgotten, the strangest, and the most disturbing of our brothers and sisters. Thérèse recognized this, writing from Carmel to Léonie, making her elder sister the first disciple of the little way. God sees and loves all of his creatures. None of us are too small or damaged or insignificant to escape his notice. Where we might see an insane person, a social nuisance, a difficult and directionless adolescent, Day sees a holy fool, and God sees a beloved son or daughter. Day's writing is infused and aglow with that awareness of being constantly surrounded by that great cloud of witnesses and the ever-present invitation extended to each of us to enter into the communion of saints.